We're now going to talk about fish. And fish first appeared, evidence of fish appeared in the fossil record about 500 million years ago. So we had a shared, once again, shared common ancestor. We're going to look at three different types of fish, or three different groups of fish. We'll go look at the jawless fish, which sort of branched off of this evolutionary pathway first of all. Then we're going to take a look at cartilaginous fish. And then we're going to finish off by just taking a really brief look at bony fish. Even though these comprise most of the fish in the ocean, it's just a vast category that we could spend weeks talking about these different types of bony fish. So fish are about one of the most abundant and accessible types of vertebrates. And of the fish, both freshwater fish and saltwater fish, 60% are marine or saltwater fish. What do we see about fish? Well, they all use gills for breathing. Most of them have fins for swimming. We'll see that there are some exceptions. They're all ectothermic, cold-blooded. We see a great diversity both in the size of fish, the shape of fish, the way they move, their lifestyles, and the habitats. So they cover a wide range of living conditions, a wide range of physical appearances. We'll first take a look at the group of fish known as jawless fish. So obviously they don't have jaws. This group includes such fish as lampreys and hagfish. Other things that we see that distinguish them from other groups of fish is they lack paired appendages to aid in locomotion. So it's almost like this worm-like body that by using muscle contraction that they're able to move themselves through water. If you look at their mouths, and here's a really excellent picture of the mouth of a jawless, this looks like a lamprey here, we find that this is a round sucking mouth, rather terror-inducing. We also find that some are parasitic, so some will actually attach themselves to another fish, another marine organism, and basically sit there and eat away, suck away at that fish, and contribute nothing to that other organism's life. I think I mentioned before that fish in the previous image was the lamprey. That was actually a hagfish. Here we have an example of a sea lamprey. No scales, another distinction from typical fish, how we typically think of fish. Large eyes, one nostril on top of the head, and then you'll see here instead of gill slits, it actually has 7 gill pores. The other difference here is it has a skeleton made up of cartilage. Because it has a skeleton made up of cartilage, just doesn't mean that we throw it in with the cartilaginous fish, such as sharks. It still remains within this jawless fish category because it has no jaw, and you can kind of sort of see the flat bottom part of its sucking mouth at its head there. Now we're back to the hagfish, and hagfish are really interesting. What can we say about hagfish? Well, they actually have more than one heart. They have several hearts. They typically contain twice as much blood in their bodies as other fish, and they are called jawless, but they have kind of like half a jaw. They're known as vultures of the sea because they seem to get most of their food simply by scavenging. And they'll scavenge anything from small little organisms to feeding on really large dead whale carcasses where they tear off big chunks of food. They also lack a true spinal cord and only have sort of like an incipient spinal cord known as a notochord. And we have notochords early on in their development as an embryo. The other thing is that these guys are really slimy and they have the ability to tie themselves into knots. It's thought that this might be a defensive mechanism. You secrete this slime as something's trying to grab you to eat you, and it makes it very difficult then for whatever wants to eat you to grab a hold of you. You literally slip through their mouth or slip through their jaws or slip through their arms. Their body is covered by pores, and it's these pores that secrete the slime or mucus, which is very fibrous. We'll see a picture in the next, an image in the next slide of what the slime looks like. But when you take the slime and you combine it with water, we'll see that it expands up to 20 liters of slime will be produced. So they can produce a tremendous amount of slime. And then it's thought that they tie themselves into knots, as one hypothesis, as a way to clean the slime off of their body. And here we have a picture of the slime that they produce. Next, we move to the sharks, and sharks are an example of cartilaginous fish. These are fish that have cartilage as their skeleton. What can we say about sharks? Well, sharks have been around for a long time on the planet. We see fossil evidence of up to about 450 million years ago. In some locations, sharks can be, depending on the species, the apex predator, so at the top of the food chain. And we'll see as we move on that sharks, there's great variability in both their size as well as their appearance. We can have sharks that can fit into the palm of your hand and sharks that are larger than school buses. Sharks is we commonly think about. So most of the common sharks, or what you picture in your mind when you think of a shark, have body plans that make it ideal for moving through the water swiftly and efficiently. It doesn't have a swim bladder. Most shark species don't have a swim bladder. Instead, they have a liver filled with lightweight fats, lipids that help them maintain buoyancy. They have that pectoral fin that helps push water downwards, helps lift the shark up in the water. They have this streamlined body plan. Once again, they have to continually swim, most species, or else they're going to sink. They have that unique tail, that heterocircle fin with the asymmetrical lobes that help them move through the water powerfully. Not great for maneuverability, but great for propelling yourself through the water. And they've been clocked some species at traveling at an average of about 8 kilometers an hour, but there are species that can travel in short bursts up to 19 kilometers an hour or quicker. There are over 400 species of shark alive today. Once again, variable in size and appearance. Here we have a dwarf lantern shark that you can basically hold in your hand. Nothing that you're going to have to worry about eating you alive. Then we have the whale shark, up to 13 meters in length, one of the largest animals on the planet. These guys eat mostly plankton. And we find that most shark species, at least less than over half of them, are approximately a meter long or less. So sharks sometimes aren't these great big predators that you think of, floating around the sea, wanting to eat everything in its path. Sometimes they're very small creatures that won't even bother you. Sharks are different from bony fish in the fact that they have cartilage that makes up their skeleton. They're also different from bony fish in the fact that they have something called dermal denticles that cover them, things called placoid scales that are different from the typical scales that we see on most normal fish. So these scales are really unique. They really help reduce drag and turbulence. That helps that shark move efficiently through the water. We see that directly on these scales, and we're looking at an electron microscope image of some scales right here, that we have direct attachments to swimming muscles. This helps saves energy. What happens is they don't grow with the animal, but as the animal increases in size, more and more of these dermal denticles are added to it. These things are so efficient in cutting down, reducing turbulence and reducing drag and helping the shark swim more effectively through the water that at one point swimsuit manufacturers such as Speedo, such as Nike, were actually mimicking this type of shark skin and making full body swimsuits that incorporated this type of scale in it, or material that mimicked what these types of scales do. And it was actually shaving seconds off of world-class swimmers' times. Since these were around I think it was in the early 2000s, swimmers are no longer allowed to use these when in most competitions, these types of suits. I just looked it up quickly, and it was during the 2008 Olympics, Summer Olympics, that these shark suits, or the swim suits based on sort of these shark dermal denticles, were really popular and were in use. If we take a look at the structure of these dermal denticles, we find that they are actually very similar to that of vertebrate teeth. So the dermal denticles that cover a shark's body are very similar to the teeth that we have in our mouth. What we see that there's an interior made of pulp, a central pulp cavity. This is supplied with blood vessels. This is surrounded by a layer of something called dentine, and then covering the dentine is enamel. So structurally, denticles, the dermal denticles on a shark, are very similar to our teeth. If you look at a shark, you talk to your dentist, he'll say, oh yeah, you have, internal pulp within your teeth covered by dentine, covered by your enamel. The shape and the structure of these denticles then is thought to help create, as water flows over the skin of the shark, tiny little vortices that help reduce drag and also make swimming more efficient and quieter compared to that of bony fish. Still on the subject of teeth, but not in relationship to dermal denticles, but the actual teeth of a shark, we'll find that the teeth are actually embedded in the gums of the shark's mouth. They're not affixed to the jaw. What this means is that sharks have teeth that are constantly replaced. They fall out very easily. And we see that sometimes teeth are replaced every 8 to 10 days or several times a month. Sharks replace one tooth at a time, whereas there's some species where an entire row of teeth will be replaced simultaneously. The teeth actually reflect the type of diet that the shark has. So if you see a very needle-like, very pointed teeth, this is really good for gripping on prey, for gripping on, for example, fish, and feeding on fish. Serrated teeth, in the lower right-hand corner there, good for feeding on mammals. Humans might be considered in that group. And then if you see teeth that are more flat, not quite as pointy, but flat on the base, these might be indicative that the shark feeds mostly on mollusks and crustaceans. So it needs that really flat tooth to actually act to help crack through the shell of the mollusk or crustacean. We find sharks throughout the world's oceans, in deep water and shallow water. We have some examples. I think it's a Greenland shark, different species of shark that can live up to 200-300 years in age. We also find sharks here off the coast of Nova Scotia. We have great white sharks that show up occasionally on the coast of Nova Scotia. Over the years, we have sharks such as one named Pumpkin that we find very close to Wolfville. We've also found sharks named Hilton that commonly tweet out tweets about the location, and quite often they're tweeting from locations close to Nova Scotia. These are all followed by different groups that track and tag the sharks and follow the location throughout the oceans as a method of shark conservation and trying to find out more information about where sharks live, where they go to lay eggs, where new baby sharks are born, all that sort of information. If you're interested in the tracking of sharks, one place to look is a website called OCEARCH, OCEARCH. You Google that and it should take you directly to their website. And you go to their website and you get information about different sharks. They also track sea turtles as well as whales, I believe. And you can see where sharks are at current position at any time during the year. To continue on, I just went on the site. I just did a quick search. There's a shark that they named Jane, white shark, female, 10 feet long, 521 pounds, who showed up off the coast of Nova Scotia just off of Lunenburg on July 24th, 2019. And her little tag pinged in at about 11 o'clock in the morning. We also have the batoids. This is another type of cartilaginous fish. These include the rays and the skates, so they're like the manta rays, the stingray rays. And what we see here is they're typically very flat-bodied, and their pectoral fins have become very, very large. They kind of dominate the body plan, and they're attached directly to the head of this particular type of fish. Like the sharks, they're also covered in dermal denticles, and in a sense, we can almost think of them as flattened sharks. So we take a shark, we really enlarge its pectoral fins, we make it very flat, and there we have. We see that their eyes and other structures, such as the gill slits, this is where they get water flowing through to bring oxygen to their bodies, are usually placed on their ventral or on what would be their bottom surface. So if you're kind of swimming over this guy, swim underneath him and looked up, you would see the gill slits, you might see eyes and other features. And here we go. Here's a picture of a batoid or a ray from the underside, and you can see the gill slits as well as the eyes. One example of a batoid is a manta ray. These can grow quite large, up to 7 meters wider in wingspan, so the tip of one of these enlarged pectoral fins to the tip of the other enlarged pectoral fin. We find them in the pelagic environment in the open ocean, quite commonly in reefs. Around reefs, they quite often visit what's known as a cleaning station. What they do is they swim around there, they hover around there, and there's tiny fish that clean off all the parasites that might be living on the skin of this particular ray. They are filter feeders. You can kind of see the mouth open in the upper image right there. They let water flow through the mouth, and they filter out all of the zooplankton, that small microscopic or smaller zooplankton that might be present in the water. They live in a variety of geographical regions throughout the ocean. We see some live in deep waters. Most of them, though, prefer tropical and subtropical marine environments, even though we have a few temperate and cold water species. A lot live in the ocean sea, and every once in a while you might see some sort of swimming around brackish estuaries and kind of getting slowly into sort of what would be considered more of a freshwater environment. If we look at their teeth, they don't have the sharp, pointy teeth that we see typical of most sharks, but they have a really heavy, rounded tooth. And that's for species that don't always filter feed or don't always feed off of zooplankton. It allows them to basically crush shells of gastropods, shells of oysters, crustaceans, and even help crush the bones of fish that it might be feeding on. But once again, that is species dependent. Finally, we reach the bony fish. And bony fish appear after in the history of life, they appear after we see the jawless fish, after we see the cartilaginous fish. We have bony fish, and they first appear in the fossil record about 422 million years ago. We're not going to go into a lot of great detail about bony fish. As I said, we could look at them for week after week after week and talk about all the different types of bony fish. But they do represent one of the largest groups of vertebrates on the planet. They are economically important. Many countries depend on the fishing industry for what terms of wealth or what terms of money it brings into a country. If you look at a skeleton, made up of bones but very strong and lightweight. They use their gills to extract oxygen from seawater, and most are ectothermic. We see that there's some larger ones that are slightly endothermic, and these are things like swordfish and tuna. They have all different types of feeding methods. Some are omnivores, some are carnivores, some are herbivores. Some fish are filter feeders, and some fish feed on detritus, leftover sort of garbage bits of other that result from the feeding of other organisms. Wide range of sizes and physical appearance of bony fish. Here are some examples. We have stuff like the sunfish, which is one of the largest bony fish that we see, or one of the heaviest bony fish we see. We have the sea dragon, which doesn't even look very fish-like. Eels, still classified as a fish, even though they don't have any paired appendages. Why are they a fish and not a jawless fish? Well, look at their mouth. He has a jaw. So fish come in a wide range of sizes and shapes. Here's a picture of an ocean sunfish, the heaviest bony fish. You'll sometimes hear anecdotes about divers that visit a certain area time after time, and they actually, in a sense, befriend these bony fish. They bring the fish food, and that fish seems to remember them from year to year to year, from dive to dive to dive. So fish employ a number of different methods to obtain food, but the big thing here is they're all heterotrophic. They have to eat other food to obtain energy. They can't make their own energy. And here we have an example of a barracuda, a good example of a carnivore, an example of a parrotfish munching away at algae, a good example of a herbivore. Even though they represent a small portion of all birds on the planet, only about 3%, we also have seabirds. And these are birds that will basically avoid land at all times except for breeding. And they're known as true seabirds. And we found that most of them occur in the southern hemisphere simply because there's more water, there's more ocean in the southern hemisphere as opposed to the northern hemisphere. So types of birds that are included in this group are tube noses, albatrosses and petrels, pelicans, gulls, penguins, which are restricted, of course, to the southern hemisphere, and puffins. And puffins are the type of seabird that we commonly see in Canada, especially off of Newfoundland. Birds have a number of special adaptations that make them excellent candidates for life at sea. Because they're living in primarily salt water, they need to have salt excreting glands. We talked about how the tube noses have the ones that run down their nasal cavity, and then they sort of drip salty snot out of the front of their nose. We find a lot of them have webbed feet that make it excellent for paddling through the water. Wing changes, we find that birds that dive like penguins tend to have shorter wings. Makes it a lot better for diving. Birds that travel long distances, such as albatrosses, have much longer wings. Some, especially the diving birds, once again, penguins have a much more streamlined shape. In addition, waterproofing. So even though they're in the water, they tend to stay nice and dry. They're also have adaptations. These will allow them not only sometimes to dive into the water after food, but will also let them travel for long distances across the ocean. One group of seabirds are the tube noses. These include albatrosses and petrels. Albatrosses have the largest wingspan of all birds. Why are they called tube noses? Well, it's because they have that tube running down their beak by which they excrete salt water, or which they excrete salt. So how do they excrete the salt that they ingest, either by drinking seawater or by eating marine invertebrates? Well, they have this enlarged nasal gland. We've already taken a look at it when we were talking about some of the adaptations that animals have for living in the ocean. And this gland might be inactive in some species, but definitely active in this species. And what it does is, we're not entirely sure what happens, but we do know that eventually what happens is salt is removed by excreting about a 5% saline solution that it either drips out of the nose, you can see it dripping off the tip of the beak in this particular bird right here, or it's forcibly injected. It's almost like a sneezing process. These birds are pelagic. They live on the open ocean. The only time they really come back to land is to return to nesting colonies. It's believed they use the ability to smell. They have really great olfactory senses that they smell to help locate either prey at sea or help locate where their nests are within a nesting colony. Albatrosses specifically are really highly efficient flyers. They use a process called either dynamic soaring or slope soaring to cover great distances with little exertion. And yeah, they spend most of their lifetime in the sea, and we see them dominating in the southern hemisphere. Another species of seabird, and these are ones that we see up in Canada, are puffins. Puffins, they have very short wings, which are great adaptations for swimming underwater, chasing after fish, which they catch and eat. They basically swim with a flying technique. So they kind of flap their wings, propel themselves through their water, and capture any fish that they might want to eat. They also eat zooplankton and are, as we see or as we can infer here, they are great divers. We see them, the Atlantic puffin, along the coastlines of the North Atlantic Ocean, along Newfoundland, and we also see some other species, two other species, known as the tufted puffin and the horned puffin. They breed in large colonies on coastal cliffs or offshore islands and make nests within crevices or burrows actually down into the soil, little nests that are sunk into the soil.